America isn't just built on dreams. It's built on secrets. Beneath the highways, behind the picket fences, inside the places people forget, something darker lives. Something you don't see in postcards or Hollywood movies. But if you listen closely, you'll hear it. The stories of people who vanished without a trace, of voices echoing from locked basements, of eyes glowing in the woods where no light should reach. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the most terrifying true horror stories from across the United States. Each one a puzzle with missing pieces, each one real, each one waiting to be told. You don't need to believe in ghosts. You just need to believe the people who live through them. So stay with us, because once you hear these stories, silence will never sound the same again. Deep in the heart of Appalachia, where the hills whisper secrets older than time, something lingers in the shadows. It's not just the wind rustling through the ancient pines or the distant howl of a coyote under a sickle moon. No, it's something heavier, something that seeps into your bones when you linger too long in the forests of North Carolina. In Bakersville, a speck of a town nestled where three great forests converge, the air hums with a strange energy. The Great Smokies loom to the south, their peaks shrouded in mist that feels alive, watching. The Pisgah National Forest stretches west, its dark hollows hiding stories no one dares repeat. And to the north, the Cherokee National Forest guards its own mysteries, where the trees seem to lean closer when you're not looking. I was born in Bakersville, raised on its red clay soil and fed by the tales of my grandmother, a woman whose eyes held the weight of 100 unspoken truths. She'd sit on the porch, her rocking chair creaking against the warped boards, and tell me things that made my young heart stutter. Never trust a man with a dimple in his chin, she'd say, her voice low, like she was sharing a secret with the devil himself. That's where his hoof pressed when he shaped their soul. I'd laugh, thinking it was just her way of teasing, but the way her gaze drifted to the horizon, sharp and unyielding, told me she believed every word. She had rules, endless, peculiar rules. Never wash clothes on a Sunday, or you'd invite Duro to your door. If your chickens laid eggs in odd numbers, burn sage and pray, for misfortune was already circling. And always, always carry a buckeye in your pocket to keep the rheumatism at bay. It wasn't just her. The people of Bakersville lived by these rituals as natural as breathing. Step on a crack and your mother's back would break. Let a black cat cross your path and you'd best turn back home. Superstition wasn't just a quirk here, it was woven into the fabric of the place, as real as the fog that clung to the valleys at dawn. I didn't understand it then, not at 12 years old when the world was still simple and the forest was just a playground. But Appalachia has a way of teaching you its truths, whether you're ready or not. The hills don't just hold secrets, they guard them fiercely, and they decide when to let you glimpse the darkness beneath. As kids, we'd swap stories under the flickering streetlights, tales of haints and boogers that haunted the ridges. But one story stuck with me, burrowing deep into my mind like a splinter. It was about a woman, a witch they said, who lived alone on Rattlesnake Ridge. Her shack sits where the snakes coil and the air turns sour, my friend Caleb whispered one night, his eyes wide with the thrill of fear. She curses men's souls, and their bodies turn to dust. I scoffed, called it nonsense, witches weren't real. But Caleb's voice trembled, and when he swore his cousin had seen her shack, smelled the smoke of her cursed fire, I felt something shift inside me. Not belief. Not yet, but a dare. A challenge. Prove it, I told him, my voice braver than I felt. Take me there. That was the moment it began. the moment I stepped toward the shadow of Rattlesnake Ridge. I didn't know then that the forest doesn't just hide witches. It hides truths that can break you. Truths that linger long after you've fled its grasp. Truths that follow you into the quiet of your dreams. What if the stories weren't just stories? That thought crept into my mind one humid summer evening, as Caleb and I sat on the rusted swing set behind his house, the chains groaning under our weight. The sky above Bakersville was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of rain, and the air carried the earthy scent of damp soil and pine. We were boys on the cusp of becoming something more, 12 and 13, old enough to question the world, young enough to chase its shadows. Caleb's voice broke the stillness, low and trembling, as he spoke of a place I'd heard of but never dared to imagine. "There's a witch up on Rattlesnake Ridge," he said, his words hanging like a curse in the twilight. "She lives in a shack all alone, and she's got the devil's magic in her bones." I laughed, the sound sharp and forced, trying to shake off the chill that snaked down my spine. A witch? In our sleepy little town? It sounded like the kind of tale kids told to scare each other, the kind of nonsense my grandmother might mutter after too many glasses of her homemade elderberry wine. But Caleb wasn't laughing. His freckled face was pale, his brown eyes wide with a fear I'd never seen in him before. He leaned closer, the swing swaying slightly, and told me what his cousin Ethan had seen. Ethan, a lanky boy of 16 who always smelled of chewing tobacco, had been hunting squirrels near the ridge one foggy morning. He'd stumbled upon a clearing, hidden deep in the forest where the air felt wrong. Thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on his chest. There in the center stood a shack, its walls weathered and blackened, as if the wood itself had soaked up the sins of the earth. Smoke curled from its chimney, twisting into the sky like the breath of something ancient, something alive. "She cursed 4 men after the war," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of cicadas in the distance. Ethan swears he heard their screams in the wind long after they died. The story was too wild, too dark to be real. 4 men cursed by a witch, their deaths shrouded in mystery. Men who'd crossed her path and paid the ultimate price. I wanted to call it a lie, to tell Caleb that Ethan was just spinning yarns to mess with us. But the way Caleb's hands trembled as he gripped the swing's chains, the way his gaze darted toward the darkening woods, made me pause. What if there was truth in the tale? What if the ridge, with its jagged slopes and venomous snakes, held more than just shadows? I couldn't let it go. Not because I believed in witches, I didn't, not then, but because I couldn't stand the thought of Caleb thinking I was afraid. "If Ethan's so sure, let's go see for ourselves," I challenged, my voice steadier than I felt. "Let's find this witch and prove she's nothing but a story." Caleb's jaw dropped, his eyes searching mine for a sign I was joking. But I wasn't. The dare hung between us, heavy and unyielding, like the storm clouds gathering overhead. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and after a long moment he nodded. "Fine, but if we die, it's on you." We made our plan that night, under the flickering glow of a single bulb on his back porch. Saturday afternoon we'd set out for Rattlesnake Ridge, armed with nothing but our stubbornness and the reckless courage of youth. The forest waited for us, its secrets buried deep in the earth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into its jaws. But I pushed the thought down, buried it beneath my bravado. After all, witches weren't real. Or so I told myself, as the first drops of rain began to fall, each one a quiet warning I was too foolish to heed. Saturday arrived with a sky so gray, it seemed the heavens themselves were mourning what we were about to do. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth, and a restless wind tugged at the sleeves of my jacket as Caleb and I set out from Bakersville. Our sneakers crunched against the gravel of the old logging trail, each step a quiet rebellion against the warnings echoing in my mind. My grandmother's voice, sharp as a blade, telling me never to tempt the spirits of the forest. But I was 12, bold with the kind of courage that only ignorance can breed, and Caleb was at my side, his jaw set in determination despite the fear flickering in his eyes. Rattlesnake Ridge loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged against the horizon, a sleeping giant draped in a cloak of pine and shadow. We were boys on a mission, chasing a myth, unaware that some myths have teeth. The forest swallowed us whole as we left the trail behind, the canopy above knitting together so tightly that the daylight dimmed to a sickly green. The ground beneath our feet was soft, carpeted with pine needles and moss, but every so often a root would snag my ankle, as if the earth itself was trying to hold me back. We moved in silence at first, the only sound our uneven breaths and the distant call of a raven, its cry slicing through the stillness like a warning. Caleb led the way, his steps heavier than mine, a habit he'd picked up from years of tramping through these woods. He'd told me once that you had to tread hard to scare off the rattlers. Snakes felt the vibrations and slithered away before you got too close. I hoped he was right. The thought of a snake, its fangs glistening with venom, made my stomach churn, but it was nothing compared to the unease creeping up my spine as we ventured deeper into the ridge. An hour passed, maybe more, and the air grew colder, heavier, as if the forest was holding its breath. We climbed a gentle slope, the ground slick with fallen leaves, and I caught the first faint whiff of smoke, sharp, acrid, curling through the trees like a phantom. My heart stuttered, a primal instinct urging me to turn back, but Caleb stopped, dead in his tracks, his head tilting as he sniffed the air. "You smell that?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of triumph and terror. "That's her fire. Ethan was right." I wanted to argue, to tell him it was just a camper, someone cooking dinner in the woods, but the words died in my throat. The smoke was too thick, too deliberate, and it carried a strange, bitter undertone, like burning herbs, or something darker. My mind flashed to the stories Caleb had told me, of a witch who boiled the bones of children to craft her charms, her fire a gateway to the devil's own magic. I didn't believe in witches. I couldn't. But the smell of that smoke, weaving through the trees, felt like a hand brushing the back of my neck, cold, insistent, and very, very real. We pressed on, following the scent like hounds on a trail, our steps slower now, more cautious. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees leaning closer, their branches clawing at the sky. My pulse pounded in my ears, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the rustle of leaves underfoot. And then we saw it, a thicket of wax myrtle trees, their leaves glossy and dark, growing so dense that they formed a natural barrier. Beyond them, barely visible through the tangle of branches, stood a structure that made my blood run cold. It was a cabin, small and hunched, its walls made of logs so weathered they looked like they'd been carved by time itself. A stone chimney jutted from one side, the source of the smoke, its gray tendrils rising into the air like a serpent uncoiling. The roof sagged under the weight of years, and the windows, if you could call them that, were mere slits dark and empty, like the eyes of a skull watching us approach. "That's it," Caleb breathed, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon whatever lived inside. "That's her shack." I wanted to laugh, to break the tension with a joke, but the sight of that cabin stole the breath from my lungs. It looked exactly like a witch's lair should, shabby, sinister, a place where nightmares took root. Near the entrance, a broomstick leaned against the wall, its bristles stained with dirt, as if it had swept through the fires of hell itself. Hanging on either side of the door were strange, twisted things. Bundles of dried herbs tied with twine, their leaves brittle and brown, and wind chimes made of bones, small and pale, swaying gently in the breeze. The air around the cabin felt wrong, heavy with a silence that pressed against my eardrums, and I swear I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows within. Caleb grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin, his face pale as death. "We need to go. Now." But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, my gaze locked on that door, waiting for it to open, waiting for the monster I'd convinced myself wasn't real. And then it happened. The door creaked open, slow and deliberate, revealing a figure that made my heart lurch into my throat. She was ancient, her hair white and patchy, clinging to her scalp in thin wisps. Her back was stooped, her hands gnarled like the roots of an old oak. And her face, oh, her face was a map of wrinkles, with a wart on her nose that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The Witch of Rattlesnake Ridge, my mind screamed. And for the first time, I believed. She stepped forward, her movements slow, predatory, and I felt the world tilt beneath me. My legs turned to jelly, my chest tight with a fear so raw it burned. Caleb's grip on my arm tightened, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and then he spoke, his voice a shaky betrayal of our hiding spot. "There she is." The witch's head snapped toward us, her eyes narrowing as she squinted into the thicket. Her voice, when it came, was a guttural rasp, sharp enough to cut through the fog of my terror. "Who's there? Y'all better show yourselves." That was all it took. The spell of paralysis broke and we ran like the hounds of hell were at our heels, our feet pounding the earth, branches snapping against our faces as we fled. The forest blurred around us, a maze of green and gray, and all I could think was that we'd made a terrible mistake. We'd trespassed on her land, and now her curse would follow us. A shadow we couldn't outrun, a doom we couldn't escape. My lungs burned as I stumbled through the forest, Caleb just a few steps behind, his ragged breaths echoing my own. The ridge seemed to stretch endlessly before us, its shadows lengthening with every step, as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep us trapped in its grasp. My mind raced, replaying the sight of the witch, her gnarled hands, her piercing eyes, the way her voice had sliced through the air like a blade. She'd seen us, she'd cursed us. The thought looped in my head, a relentless chant that fueled my panic. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of Bakersville, the familiar sight of our neighborhood, a lifeline in the chaos of our fear. We stood there panting, our clothes torn and streaked with mud, and exchanged a look that needed no words. We were doomed. I don't remember the walk to my house, only the moment I burst through the door, my chest heaving, my eyes stinging, with unshed tears. My mother was in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough for the evening's bread, and the sight of her, so ordinary, so safe, broke something inside me. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, streaming down my face. As I collapsed into a chair, she turned, her brow furrowing with concern, and before she could even ask what was wrong, the words spilled out of me in a rush. I told her everything, how I hadn't believed Caleb, how we'd gone to Rattlesnake Ridge to prove Ethan wrong, how we'd found the shack and seen the witch, how she'd spotted us and now we were cursed, destined to die like the four men in the stories. My voice cracked with every sentence, the fear pouring out of me like a river, and I barely noticed my father stepping in from the garage, his overalls smudged with grease, his face etched with quiet alarm. They listened in silence, my mother's hands stilling on the dough, my father leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed. When I finished, my chest tight with dread, I waited for their anger, for their fear, for confirmation that I'd brought doom upon us all. But instead, my mother sighed, a soft, weary sound, and wiped her hands on her apron before kneeling in front of me. "There's no such thing as witches, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentle but firm, her hands cupping my face as she brushed away my tears. "That was just an old woman, living alone up on the ridge. She's been there for years, and all she wants is to be left in peace." My father nodded, his expression softening as he stepped closer, his heavy hand resting on my shoulder. "You scared her as much as she scared you," he added, his voice low and steady. "She heard you in the bushes, that's all. There's no curse, son. You're safe." Their words should have been a comfort, a balm to the raw edges of my fear, but they felt hollow, incomplete. If she wasn't a witch, why did she live out there alone in the woods surrounded by bones and herbs? Why did the air around her shack feel so wrong? I wanted to ask, to demand answers, but my mother's calm certainty held me back. She stood, smoothing her apron, and reached for the phone on the counter. "I'll call Caleb's mom," she said, her tone practical now, as if this were just another childhood scrape to be patched up. "We'll make sure he's okay, and you two need to promise not to go snooping around that ridge again." I nodded, still trembling, as my father guided me to the couch, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of my thoughts. Caleb's parents told him the same thing. There was no witch, no curse, just a lonely old woman who'd been startled by two foolish boys. We spoke on the phone that evening, our voices shaky at first, then lighter as the fear began to ebb. We even laughed, the sound brittle but real, as we realized how absurd it was to have run from a woman who probably couldn't chase us if she tried. The terror that had gripped us on the ridge seemed to fade in the warmth of our homes, replaced by a cautious relief. But the questions lingered, heavy and unspoken. Why did she choose to live out there, so far from town? Why did the stories of her curses persist, whispered by kids and adults alike? By Monday, the incident had become a tale to tell at school, a badge of bravery we wore with pride. We told our friends how we'd faced the witch and lived, how she wasn't really a witch at all, just a strange old lady who liked her solitude. Some kids didn't believe us, swearing we'd been cursed, that our days were numbered. But we laughed them off, bolstered by our parents' assurances, by the other kids whose parents had told them the same thing. She was just a sad, eccentric woman, nothing more. The four men she'd supposedly cursed, just a coincidence, a small-town rumor blown out of proportion. And so, we moved on, the memory of that day tucked away like a bad dream, fading with time. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, a truth buried beneath the lies we'd been told, waiting to be unearthed. Years slipped away like leaves on the wind, and the memory of that day on Rattlesnake Ridge became a faded scar, something I thought of only in passing, a story to laugh about over a beer. It was 2004, and I was back in Bakersville for a rare visit. The town unchanged in its quiet simplicity. Same dirt roads, same weathered porches, same whispers of the forest that never quite left you. Caleb and I hadn't seen each other in nearly 2 years, our lives pulling us in different directions after high school. But when I heard he was in town too, I knew we had to meet up. Bakersville didn't have a bar, not a proper one anyway. So we hitched a ride to Burnsville, 10 miles south, where a little dive called the Rusty Nail promised cold beer and a pool table. The Carolina Panthers were playing that night, and I figured I'd beat Caleb at a few games while we watched the game on a grainy TV mounted above the bar. The rusty nail was a dim, smoky hole in the wall, its walls lined with faded posters of old country singers and neon signs that flickered with a tired buzz. The air smelled of stale beer and fried onions, and the jukebox in the corner played a mournful tune that blended with the murmur of the few patrons scattered across the room. Caleb and I settled at the bar, our laughter filling the space as we reminisced about the old days, school pranks, first crushes, the time we'd stolen a bottle of moonshine from his uncle's shed and regretted it the next morning. The Panthers lost, but I won at pool, so the night felt even enough. As the hours ticked by, the bar emptied out, leaving just us, a bartender wiping down the counter, and an older man at the far end of the bar, his face weathered like the oak barrels behind him, nursing a glass of whiskey with a quiet intensity. Our conversation turned to the ridge, as if the memory had been waiting for the right moment to resurface. We laughed at first, shaking our heads at how foolish we'd been. Two kids running from a harmless old woman, convinced she'd cursed us. But as the laughter faded, a shadow settled over us, a shared unease we couldn't name. "Why do you think she lived out there?" I asked, my voice softer now, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Caleb shrugged, his brow furrowing, as he stared into his beer. And those four men, why did everyone think she cursed them? We speculated idly, our voices low, as if speaking too loudly might summon the answers we weren't sure we wanted. She must have been ancient back then, we agreed, so she was probably long gone by now. Unless, Caleb joked with a nervous chuckle, she really was a witch, immortal in waiting. The older man at the bar stirred, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator sensing prey. He turned to the bartender, his voice gravelly but firm. "One more for me, and one for each of these boys. They're about to hear a story they won't forget." My heart skipped a beat, a mix of curiosity and dread pooling in my gut. He slid down the bar, taking the stool next to mine, and extended a hand rough with calluses. "Name's Henry," he said, his eyes sharp despite the lines etched deep into his face. "I used to live in Bakersville, same as you, and I know why that woman lived on the ridge, and why folks blamed her for those men's deaths." Caleb and I exchanged a glance, the air between us thick with anticipation. I should have known his story would be about her, but the beers had dulled my senses, and I found myself leaning in, eager for the truth, even as a part of me screamed to walk away. Henry's voice was a low growl, steady and unyielding, as if the weight of the story he was about to tell had carved itself into his bones. The dim light of the rusty nail cast shadows across his face, deepening the lines of a man who'd seen too much, and I felt the air in the bar grow heavy, pressing down on my shoulders like a storm about to break. Caleb sat beside me, his hands wrapped tightly around his beer, his knuckles white with tension. Henry took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving ours, and then he began. "Her name was Eleanor Mayfield," he said, the name falling, like a stone into still water, rippling through the silence. And if this were 30 years ago, I'd have kept my mouth shut. But everyone involved is long gone now, her included. So you boys deserve to know the truth, especially since you saw her with your own eyes. I opened my mouth to make a quip, something about her turning men into frogs, but the look in Henry's eyes stopped me cold. There was no humor there, only a weary resolve, and I felt a flush of shame for my flippancy. He shook his head, cutting me off before I could speak. "This ain't a fairy tale, son. Those men's deaths weren't supernatural, but they were tied to Eleanor, tied to why she chose to live out there, alone, for the rest of her days. He leaned back, his gaze drifting to the ceiling, as if he could see the past playing out in the smoke-stained beams above. And then he told us a story that turned the myth of the witch into a tragedy so raw, so brutal, that it left me hollow. Eleanor Mayfield had been a young woman in 1941, bright-eyed and hopeful, when she married a man named Thomas Harrow. They were happy, Henry said. The kind of happy that made people in Bakersville smile when they passed them on the street. Thomas was a carpenter, his hands skilled at turning rough wood into things of beauty, and Eleanor was a seamstress, her fingers deft with a needle. They dreamed of a family, of a little house filled with laughter, but the world had other plans. Pearl Harbor came, a wound that tore through the nation, and Thomas was drafted, sent to fight in North Africa against the Germans. Months later, word came back that he was missing in action, presumed dead. A mass grave had been found, American soldiers massacred by the Nazis, their bodies burned beyond recognition. Among the charred remains were fragments of Thomas's belongings, a pocket knife engraved with his initials, a letter he'd written to Eleanor, half burned but still legible. The army declared him dead, and Eleanor's world shattered. She mourned, him in black, her grief a shroud that clung to her like a second skin. For months she barely left her house, her laughter replaced by a silence that unnerved her neighbors. But by Christmas of 1943, she began to emerge from her sorrow, her eyes catching the light again. A man named Daniel, a grocery store clerk unfit for service due to a weak heart, became her solace. He was kind, soft-spoken, with a smile that warmed the coldest days, and Eleanor found herself drawn to him. She didn't want to betray Thomas's memory, so they kept their romance hidden, meeting in the quiet hours, stealing moments in the shadows of Bakersville's back roads. No one judged her, not openly anyway. The town understood her need for happiness, her need to feel alive again, and they turned a blind eye, hoping for a quiet proposal that would make her joy official. By late 1944, their secret was an open, one whispered about with knowing smiles, but still no one spoke against her. The war raged on, and Eleanor and Daniel grew closer, their love a fragile light in the darkness. But in early 1946, just as the town expected wedding bells, a telegram arrived that shattered her world anew. Thomas Harrow was alive. He'd been a prisoner in one of the last camps liberated by the Allies, found skeletal and broken, weighing barely 90 pounds. He'd survived horrors that left scars no one could see, and when he was strong enough, he asked for his wife. Eleanor received the news with a mix of relief and dread, her heart torn between the husband she'd mourned and the man who'd brought her back to life. Daniel understood, stepping back with a quiet grace. But Eleanor couldn't let him go. Not fully. Thomas returned to Bakersville a hero, greeted with cheers and tears, but the man who came back wasn't the one who'd left. His eyes were hollow, his temper sharp, and Eleanor felt the weight of his gaze like a chain around her neck. She tried to be the wife he needed, to bury her feelings for Daniel, but the pull was too strong. One night, after Thomas had been drinking with his old high school friends, he came home early and found Eleanor and Daniel together, their laughter turning to screams as his rage erupted. What followed was a nightmare so vile that Henry's voice faltered as he spoke, his hands trembling around his glass. Thomas beat Daniel senseless, his fists a blur of fury, before tying him to the bed frame with his belt. He turned on Eleanor. Next, his anger a storm that left her bruised and broken. But he didn't stop there. He forced his friends to stay, to watch, and then to join him in his cruelty, each taking their turn as Eleanor begged for mercy. Daniel, helpless, witnessed it all, his cries drowned out by the laughter of men who'd lost their humanity. When it was over, Thomas and his friends dragged Daniel into the woods, a gunshot echoing through the night. They hid his body somewhere, near Rattlesnake Ridge, a secret they swore to take to their graves. And Thomas locked Eleanor in their home for days, her body battered, her spirit shattered. When he finally cast her out, barefoot and broken, Eleanor limped into town, her dress torn and stained, and went straight to the sheriff. She told him everything: the assault, the murder, the horror she'd endured. The sheriff confronted Thomas, but he denied it all, claiming he'd only roughed Daniel up for betraying him, that Daniel had fled town out of shame. Without a body, without witnesses, the sheriff had no case, though the town whispered their outrage. Eleanor retreated to her parents' home, sinking into a depression so deep it seemed she'd never climb out. Months passed, and Thomas and his friends grew, bold, believing they'd escape justice. But then, one night, Bakersville awoke to chaos. Thomas's house burned to the ground, his body reduced to ash in what the state patrol later ruled as arson. That same night, his two friends met their own grisly ends. One crashed his car into a tree on a clear road, the other poisoned by a bottle of bad whiskey, his body found cold and stiff. The town was in uproar, the deaths too coincidental to ignore, and whispers of Eleanor's curse began to spread. She'd been seen smiling, for the first time since the attack, her spirit lifting as if the deaths had freed her from a weight she couldn't name. She began taking long walks into the woods, always to Rattlesnake Ridge, searching for Daniel's body. Her steps a quiet pilgrimage to a love she'd lost. Years passed, and one day, Eleanor stopped coming home. Some said she'd taken her own life, others that a snake or a bear had claimed her. But then word spread of a shack on the ridge, a place she'd made her own, where she lived out her days in solitude, searching for closure. The stories of her as a witch grew from there, a shield to keep the curious away, to bury the truth in myth. She wanted to be left alone, Henry finished, his voice heavy with sorrow. To find Daniel, to mourn him, to escape a world that failed her. May they both rest in peace. I sat there, the bars silent around us, my heart a hollow ache as the myth of the witch dissolved into the tragedy of Eleanor Mayfield. Have you ever felt the forest watching you? It's not a sound, not a shadow, but a weight. A cold, invisible gaze that presses against your skin, making every step feel like a trespass. That's what I felt on the fourth day of our hike along the Appalachian Trail in Tennessee, a stretch of wilderness so vast it seemed to swallow the world whole. My friend Nathan and I had set out with high spirits, our backpacks stuffed with camping gear, our minds buzzing with the thrill of adventure. We'd camped before, up in the Northeast where the woods were tame and the nights were safe. But Appalachia was different, wilder, older, its air thick with a quiet menace that clung to us like damp moss. By day 4, exhaustion had settled into our bones, our legs aching from endless miles, our bodies begging for rest. Sleep had been a stranger, the thin walls of our tent no match for the heat of a Tennessee summer, or the constant rustle of the unknown just beyond our campfire's glow. We trudged along the trail, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the path. My shirt clung to my back, soaked with sweat, and Nathan's face was flushed, his breaths coming in short, tired huffs. We hadn't spoken much that day, our energy sapped by the relentless terrain. Rocky slopes, tangled roots, and the ever-present hum of insects that seemed to mock our struggle. But then, just as the light began to fade, a figure appeared on the trail ahead, a lone hiker, his silhouette sharp against the golden haze of dusk. He was older, maybe in his 40s, with a weathered pack slung over one shoulder and a walking stick in hand, his face etched with the kind of calm that only comes from years in the wild. We stopped to talk, eager for any news of the trail ahead, and his words were a lifeline. "There's a shelter up ahead," he said, his voice gravelly but warm, his eyes crinkling with a knowing smile. "About 10 miles further, on the right side of the trail. It's got 2 platforms, one high, one low. If you push hard, you'll make it by nightfall." A shelter. The word alone felt like a promise of salvation, a roof over our heads, a chance to sleep without the suffocating heat of our tent, without the fear of what might slither or crawl in the dark. I glanced at Nathan, his exhaustion mirrored in my own aching limbs, and we nodded in silent agreement. We thanked the hiker, our voices thick with gratitude, and set off with renewed purpose, our steps quicker now, driven by the hope of rest. The forest seemed to watch us as we went, its shadows deepening, its silence growing heavier, as if it knew something we didn't. But we pressed on, blind to the danger waiting in the dark. The shelter came into view just as the last light of day bled from the sky. A crude wooden structure nestled in a clearing, its silhouette stark against the darkening forest. It wasn't the cozy cabin we'd imagined. No door, no fireplace, just a rough-hewn frame with 2 raised platforms, one taller than the other, like uneven steps leading nowhere. The roof slanted at an odd angle, its shingles weathered and curling, and the walls were open on 3 sides, offering little protection from the elements. But to us it was a palace, a refuge from the suffocating heat of our tent, a chance to sleep without the constant dread of unseen creatures lurking. In the night, we tossed our packs onto the lower platform, claiming it as our own, and set about making dinner, the smell of canned beans and instant coffee a small comfort in the vastness of the wild. We'd barely finished eating, the fire's embers glowing, faintly at our feet when 2 figures emerged from the trail, a man and a woman, their steps heavy with exhaustion, their faces shadowed by the fading light. They were a couple, I guessed, maybe in their late 20s, their matching hiking gear suggesting a shared journey, though their expressions told a different story. The man was tall, his jaw tight with frustration, his eyes darting to the woman beside him with barely concealed irritation. She was shorter, her hair pulled back in a messy braid, her lips pressed into a thin line as she avoided his gaze. "Is the other platform free?" the man asked, his voice clipped, as if the words were an effort. We nodded, forcing a smile, and told them we'd be good bunkmates, hoping for a quiet night where we could all find some rest. But the peace we craved shattered almost as soon as they settled in. They dropped their packs on the upper platform, their movements sharp and tense, and within minutes the whispers began. Low, heated arguments that drifted down to us like a storm brewing on the horizon. "You never listened to me," I heard, her hiss, her voice sharp with frustration, while he shot back something too quiet to catch, his tone laced with exasperation. They'd stop for a moment, the silence heavy with unspoken resentment, only to start again, their words a jagged rhythm that grated on my nerves. Nathan and I exchanged a glance, the warmth of our dinner fading as the tension in the air grew, thick, suffocating. What had started as a night of hope was unraveling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was listening, waiting for the moment to strike. The night deepened, the forest wrapping us in a shroud of darkness so thick it felt like a living thing, pressing against the edges of our shelter. The fire had died to a faint glow, its warmth long gone, leaving the air cool and heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Nathan and I lay on our platform, our sleeping bags pulled tight around us, trying to find sleep amidst the unease that had settled over the clearing. But the couple above us had other plans. Their argument, which had simmered through the evening, flared to life again. their voices cutting through the stillness like shards of glass. "You never listen to me," the woman snapped, her words sharp enough to make me flinch, her frustration echoing in the hollow space. The man's response was a low growl, his tone thick with exhaustion and anger. "It's too far, Emily. We won't make it in time." I couldn't make out everything they said, their words a tangled mess of resentment and hurt, but the rhythm of their fight was relentless. Starting, stopping, then starting again, each cycle louder than the last. Nathan shifted beside me, his irritation palpable, and I knew he was on the verge of telling them to quiet down. I felt it too, the frustration boiling in my chest, but I held my tongue, hoping they'd tire themselves out. They didn't. The argument grew sharper, their voices rising until the woman's tone turned biting, her words a defiant challenge. "Fine, then maybe that's exactly what I'll do." The air seemed to still, the forest holding its breath as the sound of movement followed. Her pack being dragged across the platform, her boots hitting the wooden ladder with a deliberate thud. I sat up, my heart pounding as she climbed down, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness like a blade. She was leaving, walking off into the night, alone, with nothing but that frail light to guide her. The man called after her, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. "Don't do this, Emily." But she didn't stop. Her silhouette moved toward the trail, her steps quick and determined, the beam of her flashlight bobbing with every stride. Nathan and I exchanged a glance, our unease turning to alarm. Hiking alone at night on the Appalachian Trail was a death wish. Snakes, bears, uneven terrain, all waiting to claim a careless step. "Excuse me, miss, I wouldn't do that if I were you," Nathan called out, his voice steady but urgent, trying to reason with her. Her response was a sharp curse, flung back at us like a stone, her anger a shield against our concern. We shrank, back stunned by her venom, but the man on the platform above us tried one last time, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Emily, come back." She didn't listen. Her light grew fainter, swallowed by the trees, until it was just a pinprick in the distance, a fragile spark in a sea of black. Nathan and I sat in silence, the weight of her decision pressing down. On us, the forest around us suddenly alive with unseen threats. I couldn't shake the image of her out there, alone, the darkness closing in, and I knew, deep in my gut, that something terrible was about to happen. The silence that followed. Emily's departure was suffocating, a heavy void that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the forest. Nathan and I sat frozen on our platform, the darkness pressing against us, our minds racing with the same unspoken fear. What if something happened to her? The man above us, her partner, was a storm of conflicting emotions, his breaths ragged as he muttered to himself, his anger warring with his worry. Nathan shifted closer to the edge of our platform, his voice low but firm. "You should go after her," he said, his words a quiet command, a nudge toward action. The man's response was sharp, laced with defiance. "If she wants to leave, let her leave." But his voice trembled, betraying the fear he was trying to hide, and I knew he'd regret those words if he didn't act soon. Nathan pressed harder, his tone edging into frustration. "If you're too scared to go after her, I will." The air crackled with tension, the man's anger flaring at the challenge, his voice a low growl as he snapped back. "What did you just say to me?" I felt my stomach drop, the threat of a confrontation looming over us, two strangers in the middle of nowhere, tempers fraying in the dark. I slid out of my sleeping bag, my hands fumbling for my boots, ready to intervene, to do something, anything to stop this night from spiraling further. But before I could speak, before their argument could escalate into violence, A sound tore through the night, a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It was a scream, high, piercing, raw with terror, echoing through the trees like a banshee's wail. It cut through the tension in the shelter, silencing us all, our breaths catching in our throats as the forest seemed to shudder around us. For a moment, we were statues, our bodies locked in place, our minds struggling to process the horror of that sound. And then it came again, a second scream, even louder, even more desperate. A plea for help that jolted us into action. I yanked on my boots, my hands shaking, as Nathan grabbed his flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness. The man above us moved faster than I thought possible. His earlier hesitation burned away by the sound of Emily's voice, and he was down the ladder before we could blink, his own flashlight in hand, his face pale with dread. We ran toward the screams, the trail a blur of shadows and roots, our lights bouncing wildly as we stumbled through the undergrowth. The man, Emily's partner, was ahead of us, his speed fueled by a primal need to reach her, his voice calling her name in a desperate chant. "Emily! Emily, hold on!" The screams grew louder as we closed the distance, each one a dagger in my chest, my mind racing with images of what we might find. A bear? A snake? Something worse? The forest was a labyrinth of darkness, the trees looming like sentinels, their branches clawing at us as we ran, the air thick with the scent of pine and fear. And then we saw her, just off the trail, her body crumpled on the ground, her flashlight lying a few feet away, its beam casting a ghostly glow on the scene. Emily was clutching her leg, her face twisted in agony, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps as she screamed again, the sound raw and broken. "He's here! He's still here!" she cried, her voice trembling with terror, her eyes wide as she stared into the darkness beyond us. I dropped to my knees beside her, my heart pounding, and saw the unnatural angle of her leg, her knee bent in a way it shouldn't, the bone clearly broken, the injury so severe it made my stomach churn. Nathan was at her other side, his hands hovering over her, unsure where to touch, while her partner fell to his knees, his hands shaking as he reached for her. "Who's here?" I asked, my voice barely audible over her sobs, my eyes scanning the trees, searching for movement, for anything that might explain this nightmare. "The man who broke my leg," she gasped, her words a punch to the gut, her fear infectious as it spread through us. A man, not an animal, not an accident, but a deliberate attack. Someone had been out there waiting in the dark, and they'd struck her with enough force to shatter her bone. My mind reeled, the implications sinking, and as Nathan swung his flashlight in a wide arc, its beam cutting through the shadows, searching for the threat we couldn't see. "I don't see anyone," he called back, his voice tight with panic, his light darting from tree to tree, but the forest gave nothing away. We had to move, had to get her back to the shelter, but every second felt like an eternity, the darkness around us alive with the threat of her attacker. I supported her left side, Nathan her right, while her partner took the lead, his flashlight scanning the trail as we half carried, half dragged her back. Her screams had turned to whimpers, her body trembling against mine, and I could feel the weight of her fear, the weight of the unknown pressing down on us all. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart leap into my throat, my eyes darting to the shadows, expecting to see a figure emerge, a man with a weapon, his face hidden, his intentions deadly. But nothing came, and we reached the shelter, our breaths ragged, our bodies trembling, the night stretching on like a nightmare we couldn't wake from. Back at the shelter, the air was thick with fear, the kind that clings to your skin and seeps into your bones, making every shadow a threat, every sound a promise of danger. We laid Emily on the lower platform, her body trembling, her breath shallow as she clutched her broken leg, her face pale and slick with sweat. Her partner knelt beside her, his hands hovering over her, his eyes wide with a mix of guilt and terror. Nathan and I moved quickly, grabbing our knives and hatchets, our makeshift weapons feeling pitiful against the unknown that lurked in the forest. We were armed, but it didn't feel like enough. Not when we didn't know what we were up against. Not when the darkness seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. "I didn't see his face," Emily whispered, her voice trembling as we tended to her leg, wrapping it as best we could with a torn shirt, trying to stabilize the break. "But I saw him running away after he hit me. It was a man, I'm sure of it. He used something, a stick, maybe a bat. It wasn't a kick, he came out of nowhere." Her words sent a chill down my spine, the image of a faceless man striking her in the dark, etching itself into my mind. She was certain he'd meant to hurt her, certain he'd fled when he heard us coming, our flashlights and shouts driving him back into the shadows. But the thought that he might return, that he might be watching us even now, made my stomach churn with dread. We took turns standing guard, Nathan and I pacing the edges of the shelter, our flashlights sweeping the perimeter, our eyes straining to catch any hint of movement. The man, Emily's partner, stayed by her side, his knife clutched in his hand, his face a mask of anguish as he whispered apologies she couldn't hear, her pain pulling her in and out of consciousness. The night stretched on, endless and suffocating. The forest a sea of black that seemed to shift and breathe around us. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart leap into my throat, my grip tightening on the hatchet until my knuckles ached. I kept imagining him out there, the man who'd attacked her, his eyes glinting in the dark, waiting for a chance to finish what he'd started. If he had a gun, we'd be helpless. Our flashlights would be targets, our lives snuffed out before. We even saw him coming. Dawn broke slowly, a pale gray light creeping through the trees, chasing away the shadows but not the fear. We hadn't slept, our bodies wired with adrenaline, our minds haunted by the what-ifs that had plagued us through the night. With the first rays of sunlight, we fashioned a makeshift stretcher from branches and our sleeping bags, laying Emily on it as gently as we could. Her face was drawn, her eyes hollow, but she managed a weak nod as we prepared to move. The trail to Hampton, the nearest town, was a grueling trek, our steps slow and deliberate as we carried her, her partner leading. The way, his flashlight now useless in the morning light. The forest seemed less menacing now, its secrets hidden in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the man who'd attacked her was still out there, waiting for another chance. Hampton was a small, sleepy town, its streets quiet in the early morning, the air cool and crisp with the promise of a new day. We found a clinic, its sign faded but welcoming, and the staff took Emily in, their faces grim as we explained what had happened. We stayed with her partner as he dealt with the aftermath. Police reports, medical forms, the endless questions that yielded no answers. The police were sympathetic but clueless, their resources stretched thin, their search for the attacker, a needle in a haystack. Emily's leg would heal, they said, but the trauma would linger, a scar that wouldn't fade. Nathan and I decided to stay in town, renting a cheap motel room to rest, to process what we'd been through. We couldn't go back to the trail, not after that night, not with the memory of her scream still echoing in our minds. We kept in touch with the couple, checking in to make sure Emily was okay, hoping for news of the man who'd attacked her. But the police never found him, the case fading into the background like so many others. We finished our hike eventually, skipping ahead 10 miles to avoid the site of the attack, but I never slept the same way again. My survival knife stayed close, a cold comfort against the nightmares that followed me. A reminder of the lesson I'd learned the hard way. The Appalachian Trail isn't just home to bears and snakes. It's home to monsters of a different kind. The kind that wear human skin and strike in the dark. What if the forest knew you were coming? That thought didn't cross my mind as I hiked through the Glastonbury section of the Appalachian Trail in Vermont. The summer sun filtering through the canopy in golden streaks, painting the forest floor, with a warmth that felt like a promise. It was the break between my sophomore and junior year of college, a time when the world seemed wide open, and my best friend Lena had convinced me to tackle this stretch of the trail with her. We'd hiked together before, smaller trails where the biggest challenge was a steep incline or a muddy patch. But the Appalachian Trail was different, a beast of its own, with miles of untamed wilderness that stretched on like a living thing, breathing, watching, waiting. By day 3, we were still riding the high of adventure, our laughter echoing through the trees, our boots kicking up dust as we walked, our spirits buoyed by the beauty around us. The air was crisp, scented with pine and the faint sweetness of wildflowers, and the trail wound through a landscape that felt both ancient and alive. Towering oaks, their leaves rustling in the breeze, and the occasional glimpse of a deer darting through the undergrowth. Lena walked a few steps ahead, her ponytail swinging with each stride, her voice bright as she pointed out a hawk circling above. "Look at that," she called, her smile wide, her eyes alight with the joy of the moment. "Isn't this worth every blister?" I grinned, nodding, my own heart swelling with the freedom of the trail, the sense that we were part of something bigger, something timeless. But then, as we rounded a bend, Lena stopped short, her hand shooting out to grab my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice suddenly tight, her gaze fixed on something in the trees. A flash of red, stark against the green, hanging from a branch like a warning we were too naive to heed. The red cloth hung like a wound against the forest's green heart, its edges frayed, its color too bright, too deliberate to be anything but a marker. It dangled from a low branch, swaying gently in the breeze, and the sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, a primal instinct whispering that something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Lena's grip on my arm tightened, her breath hitching as we exchanged a glance, our earlier laughter replaced by a heavy silence. "Who leaves something like that out here?" she murmured, her voice barely audible, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and unease. I shrugged, trying to shake off the dread creeping into my chest, and forced a smile. "Probably just some hiker's trash," I said, my tone lighter than I felt. "Let's grab it and toss it when we get back to town." We stepped off the trail, the undergrowth crunching beneath our boots, the air growing cooler as we moved deeper into the trees. The forest seemed to close in around us, the light dimming as the canopy thickened, the shadows stretching long and thin like fingers, reaching for us. My heart beat faster with every step, the red cloth drawing us closer, its presence a magnet we couldn't resist. And then we saw it, beneath the branch in the dirt. 2 shallow pits, each about 6 feet long, their edges rough but deliberate, their shapes unmistakable. Graves. 2 empty graves side by side, waiting like open mouths in the earth, their purpose chillingly clear. "There's 2 of them," Lena whispered, her voice trembling, her face pale as she stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. 2 graves, 2 of us. The realization hit me like a punch, my stomach lurching. As the forest spun around me, the air suddenly thick with a fear I couldn't name. Someone had dug these graves, marked them with that red cloth, and left them here, waiting. For us? For someone else? My mind raced, images of a faceless killer flashing through my thoughts, a predator hiding in the trees, watching, planning. We didn't touch the cloth, didn't dare disturb the scene. Our earlier bravado shattered by the stark reality of those empty holes. We turned and ran, our feet pounding the earth, the trail a blur as we fled, the forest's silence roaring in our ears, the grave's unspoken threat chasing us back to civilization. The trail stretched endlessly before us as we ran, our breaths ragged, our hearts pounding with a fear that clung to us like a second skin. The forest, once a place of beauty and wonder, had transformed into a labyrinth of menace, its trees looming like silent witnesses to a crime we couldn't comprehend. Lena's hand gripped mine, her fingers cold despite the summer heat, her face pale as we pushed forward, desperate to put distance between us and those empty graves. My mind raced, replaying the sight of those pits, their rough edges, their deliberate shapes, the red cloth hanging above them like a bloodstain in the air. Someone had dug them, someone with a purpose, and the thought of what that purpose might be made my stomach churn with dread. Were they meant for us? For some other unsuspecting hiker? Or were they a sick prank, a cruel joke left to terrify anyone? Who stumbled upon them? We didn't stop until we reached the edge of Bennington, a small town nestled at the foot of the trail, its streets quiet in the late afternoon light, its normalcy a stark contrast to the terror we'd just fled. My legs burned, my chest tight with exhaustion, but the fear hadn't loosened its grip. Not yet. We found a payphone outside a gas station, its glass booth smudged with fingerprints, and I fumbled for change, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. Lena stood beside me, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes darting to the tree line as if expecting someone to emerge, to chase us down and finish what the graves had promised. The operator's voice was calm, professional, a lifeline in the chaos of my thoughts, and I poured out our story. The red cloth, the graves, the overwhelming sense that we'd escaped something terrible. The officer who took the call was polite, his tone steady as he promised to send someone to investigate, and he gave me his direct number, a small gesture that felt like a lifeline, a promise that we weren't alone. But the relief I'd hoped for didn't come. As we sat in a diner across the street, nursing cups of coffee that had long gone cold, Lena and I wrestled with what to do next. The hike had been our dream, a chance to conquer the trail together, to prove we could handle its challenges. Lena wanted to keep going, her voice firm despite the fear still lingering in her eyes. "We can skip ahead," she said, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, her gaze fixed on the table. "Catch a ride to the next town, get back on the Tice trail. We've come too far to quit now." I wanted to agree, to hold on to the dream we'd shared, but the image of those graves wouldn't leave me. Their empty depths, the red cloth swaying like a warning, the unspoken threat they carried. "What if there are more?" I asked, my voice low, my hands tightening around my cup. "What if someone's out there waiting, digging graves for anyone who passes by?" The thought was too much, the fear too raw, and I knew I couldn't go back. Not now, not with that shadow hanging over us. We checked into a motel that night, a small faded place with peeling wallpaper and a flickering neon sign. The hum of the air conditioner a poor substitute for the trail's quiet. Next morning I called the sheriff again, hoping for answers, for some innocent explanation that would erase the terror of what we'd seen. But he hadn't even been to the site yet, his voice apologetic but distant as he promised to check it out soon. "We'll get to it today," he said, but his words felt hollow, a formality that did nothing to ease my mind. Lena sat on the edge of the bed, her face a mix of frustration and resignation, her dream of finishing the hike slipping away with every passing second. I couldn't do it. I couldn't walk back into those woods knowing what we'd found, knowing that the graves might not be the only ones out there. It's not just a prank, I told her, my voice steady despite the fear that still gripped me. Not with that much effort. Someone dug those graves, marked them, left them there for a reason. I'm not betting my life on it being a joke. Lena nodded, her shoulders slumping, her anger giving way to acceptance. We packed our bags, called for a ride, and left the trail behind. The memory of those graves a weight we'd carry long after we'd returned home. The forest had shown us its darkness, and I wasn't willing to risk seeing more. Some things are meant to stay buried until they aren't. That thought didn't cross my mind a few years back when I set out with 3 friends, Mark, Julia, and Ethan, for a weekend hike on the Appalachian Trail near in-town Pennsylvania. The trail was a familiar escape, a stretch of wilderness we'd tackled before. Its rolling hills and dense forests, a welcome break from the grind of our daily lives. We'd packed light, our backpacks slung over our shoulders, our laughter filling the air as we walked, the late summer sun casting dappled patterns on the path. By midday, we were deep in the forest, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth, the sound of our boots crunching against the gravel, a steady rhythm that lulled us into a sense of peace. We stopped at a cluster of rocks, their surfaces smooth and cool, a natural resting spot that felt like it had been waiting for us. Mark stretched his legs, his lanky frame casting a long shadow, and as he circled the largest rock, he froze, his hand reaching down to the base. "What's this?" he called, his voice tinged with curiosity, his fingers brushing against something metallic half buried in the dirt. He pulled it free, a small, old-fashioned tin, the kind that might have once held candies, its lid hinged and rusted, its surface scratched with the scars of time. We gathered around, our earlier laughter fading, replaced by a quiet intrigue. Mark pried the lid open, revealing 2 folded pieces of paper inside, their edges yellowed, their presence a mystery that hung heavy in the still air of the forest. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Mark set the tin on the rock, its rusted surface glinting faintly in the sunlight, a relic of a past we couldn't yet fathom. He unfolded the first piece of paper with careful fingers, the yellowed edges crumbling slightly under his touch, and held it up for us to see. On one side was a crude drawing, jagged lines forming a cluster of rocks and trees, eerily similar to the spot where we stood, the strokes heavy and uneven as if drawn in a hurry, in a panic. My stomach twisted, a cold unease creeping into my chest. But before I could speak, Mark flipped the paper over, revealing a single line scrawled in shaky handwriting. This was the last thing Sarah ever saw. The words hit like a physical blow, their meaning sinking in slowly, heavily, as the forest around us seemed to grow darker, the air thicker with a dread I couldn't name. "What does that even mean?" Julia whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wide as she stared at the paper, her hands clutching the straps of her backpack like a lifeline. Mark's face had gone pale, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet horror, his gaze darting between the paper and the rocks around us, as if expecting to see Sarah's ghost emerge from the trees. I took the paper from him, my hands unsteady, the words burning into my mind. Sarah, whoever she was, had seen this place, these rocks, these trees, and then... what? Died. Disappeared. The drawing felt like a snapshot of her final moments, a haunting echo of a tragedy we'd stumbled into, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on cursed ground. Ethan, ever the skeptic, reached for the second piece of paper, his movements sharp with impatience, as if he could dispel the fear with action. He unfolded it quickly, his brow furrowing as he scanned the contents, his expression darkening with every word. "It's a list," he said, his voice low, his fingers tightening around the paper. "List of people I want to apologize to, and then names. People she stole from." He read the names aloud. Mary, John, Clara, a dozen others, each one paired with a vague confession. Stole your necklace, stole your savings, stole your trust. The handwriting was different, shakier than the first note. The ink smudged in places as if written through tears, through guilt, through desperation. My mind raced, trying to piece it together. Was this Sarah's list? A final act of remorse? Before she ended her life? Or was it someone else's confession? Someone who'd harmed her, left her in this forest to die? "It's a suicide note," Mark said, his voice hollow, his eyes fixed on the paper in Ethan's hand. "She came out here, wrote this, and did it." But Julia shook her head, her face pale, her voice rising with panic. "No, it doesn't make sense. Why just list the people she stole from? Where's the apology to her family? And that first note, who wrote that? It's not the same handwriting." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight, his gaze darting to the trees as if searching for answers in their shadows. "Maybe someone else wrote the first one. Someone who knew what happened to her." The implication hung heavy between us. The possibility of a crime, a murder, a secret buried in this forest, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. The air growing colder, the sunlight dimming as if the forest itself was mourning Sarah's fate. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees leaning closer, their shadows stretching long and thin across the ground, as if trying to swallow the tin and its secrets. We stood there, the papers trembling in our hands, the weight of Sarah's story pressing down on us, a mystery we couldn't ignore. "We need to look around," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, my eyes scanning the undergrowth for any sign of what might have happened here. "If this is real, if something happened to her, we can't just walk away." Mark nodded, his face still pale, his hand shoving the papers back into the tin as if touching them burned him. Julia hesitated, her gaze darting to the trees, her fear palpable. But Ethan was already moving, his steps cautious but determined, his eyes searching the ground for clues. We fanned out around the rocks, our movements slow, deliberate, the air thick with a tension that made every rustle of leaves feel like a threat. I walked in a wide circle, my boots sinking into the soft earth, my heart pounding as I looked for anything. Disturbed soil, a shallow grave, a sign that Sarah had been here, that her story had ended in this forest. The ground was uneven, patches of dirt mixed with moss and fallen leaves, but nothing stood out. No clear evidence of a struggle, no trace of a body. "Watch for anything unusual," I called to Ethan, my voice low, my eyes scanning the earth for signs of digging, for a grave that might hold Sarah's remains. But the forest gave nothing away, its secrets buried deep, its silence a wall we couldn't break through. After what felt like hours, though it was likely only 20 minutes, we regrouped at the rocks, our faces drawn, our hands empty of answers. "There's nothing here," Julia said, her voice small, her arms wrapped around herself as if to ward off the chill that had settled over us. "No body, no signs, nothing." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight, his gaze distant as he stared at the tin in Mark's hands. "It could still be a prank," he said, but his tone lacked conviction, the possibility of a darker truth lingering in the air. I shook my head, the words on the first note echoing in my mind. This was the last thing Sarah ever saw. "We can't take that chance," I said, my voice firm, my decision made. "We're taking this to the police." We packed the tin into Mark's backpack, its weight heavier than it should have been. A burden we couldn't leave behind. The hike to the next town was a quiet one, our earlier laughter replaced by a heavy silence. The forest around us no longer, place of escape but a witness to a mystery we couldn't solve. When we reached the small police station, its brick facade faded and unassuming, we handed the tin over, explaining our find with voices that trembled despite our efforts to stay calm. The officer listened, his expression unreadable, and promised to look into it. But his words felt hollow, a formality that did little to ease the unease that had settled into my bones. We left the station, the tin and its secrets no longer our burden, but the memory of Sarah's last moments lingered, a shadow that followed us long after we'd left the trail behind. You've just walked through some of the darkest corners of America's haunted past, but don't be fooled. These stories didn't stay in the past. They linger in the places we forget, in the shadows we ignore, and maybe, just maybe, in your town too. What you heard tonight wasn't fiction, it was a warning. Because fear doesn't always come with fangs or chains. Sometimes it knocks softly and waits. But if you're still curious, if you need to know what's lurking just beyond the next story, then stay close, subscribe, turn on notifications, and don't miss what's coming next. Because the scariest thing about these stories, they never really end. They just find new listeners. And if you've made it this far, congratulations. You're one of them now.